Money FM 89.3, the best of Saturday mornings. International News Review.
And we are back in the studio with the International News Review. Today we are focusing on the Shangri-La Dialogue. It has just begun yesterday here in Singapore. The annual forum began in 2002, gives an open and neutral platform to exchange perspectives on defense and security across the region and around the world. That's the way the Ministry of Defense here in Singapore talks about it. The first plenary session today, entitled United States Ambitions for the Indo-Pacific Security. We've heard from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth already. But first, let's get a bit of an overview from a special guest that we have in the studio with us. Abraham Denmark is a partner at the Asia Group and has played many roles as a specialist in security and geopolitical dynamics across the Indo-Pacific region. He led the U.S. Department of Defense efforts to develop and implement AUKUS. Those of you that are familiar with that, has worked in government as the Assistant Secretary for Defense in East Asia. So many roles, we don't even have time to get through all of his great roles, but eminently qualified to discuss this today. Abe, thanks for being with us in the studio, in town from the U.S. How do you view the Shangri-La Dialogues?
Well, thanks for having me. I've been to several Shangri-La Dialogues, usually in the staff of a Secretary of Defense coming here. But the Shangri-La Dialogue is a critical forum for all the powers of the Indo-Pacific to come together to talk about the critical security issues of the day, to compare notes and to meet on the sidelines with academics, with industry, and really it's a critical place for everybody to get together. It's also, I think, a very important element of Singapore's soft power, being able to bring all these countries together to serve as a neutral space, as a safe and comfortable place for all these countries to come together over the years, I think more than 20 years at this point. So I think it shows a lot of the very important role that Singapore plays in the Indo-Pacific, and especially it helps grow Singapore's soft power across the region.
It's interesting because I was looking at Western media this morning. Doesn't get that much attention. Obviously it does here because we're hosting it. So give us a sense of what goes on behind closed doors. You know, tea and biscuits and defense deals discussed. What actually goes on in the Shangri-La, away from the speeches? Yeah,
so when you're in the staff, when you're working for Secretary of Defense, there's a lot of members of Congress, senators here. It's a whirlwind. There's a speech that you're helping write the speech on the plane. You're perfecting the messaging. And then when folks land, there's a ton of meetings on the sidelines, private meetings between ministers, between key industry leaders, key academics. So it's just one thing after another. It's a real whirlwind. It's sort of one-stop shopping in terms of engagements, which was why secretaries of defense, going back over several administrations, take the incredibly long flight all the way from Washington, D.C. to Singapore.
On their private jets? What a shame.
That's true.
Carbon footprints.
In order to come here, because there's so many important meetings to be had, important discussions to be had, and it's a great opportunity for the United States to speak directly to the Indo-Pacific and say, this is our strategy, this is our approach.
And last point on that, does much actually get done? Because cynically, you get lots of bilateral agreements. There's always lots of bilateral agreements. But do things actually get done? Do people leave the Shangri-La with firm deals in place between countries?
So the deals don't usually happen at Shangri-La. The messages happen.
Right.
And from the point of view of senior leaders, from the point of view of a Secretary of Defense, the message is often the deliverable, that we were able to clearly say to the entire region, this is our approach, these are our priorities, and to listen from them directly. So sometimes you're able to come up with a agreement. There's often bilateral and trilateral meetings, and sometimes there's deliverables coming out of those. But most of the time, it's the messaging themselves and then the private meetings that happen on the sidelines.
Thanks for bringing up that idea of messaging, and we're talking to Abe Denmark, partner at the Asia Group. Messaging last night was front and center for the French president, Emmanuel Macron. He literally took a shot over the bow in his opening remarks last night. The first time a European leader has given the keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogues. He said, we want to, quote, we want to cooperate, but we don't want to depend. We want to cooperate, but we don't want to be instructed on a daily basis on what is allowed and what is not allowed and how our life will change because of the decisions of a single person, very clearly aimed at one individual who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. What did you make of that, pretty strong statement, opening statement at this particular conference?
I thought it was a very clear message. It was actually a fairly traditional message coming from Macron and coming from France, who's wanted to maintain a degree of independence in NATO during the Cold War and since. Similar to his messaging before the outbreak of war in Ukraine, talking about the need for major powers to avoid war and for smaller powers to find a third way out of this sort of confrontation, out of this sort of competition, that the smaller powers don't need to get caught up into these major power conflicts and competitions and find their own way, and really offering France and Europe as a way for the countries of the Indo-Pacific to identify that place. A message that I think will be very appealing in much of Southeast Asia, which does try to find a way to not take sides in the burgeoning competition between China and the United States.
I am fascinated by President Macron this week. I mean, he's been on this whirlwind PR tour almost. He was in Indonesia. He went to Vietnam. I think that's the first time a French president has been to Vietnam for 10 years. Obviously, he was in Singapore. He was taking selfies at Lau Pa Sat with Singaporeans, and Prime Minister Lawrence Wong was keeping him company. He really has become the face, so far, of this Shangri-La Dialogue. Is this part of a wider plan for France and Europe more broadly to build stronger ties in this part of the world? And I don't want to use the word capitalize, but maybe it is that, and sort of sneak into Southeast Asia while this conflict goes on, or this tension goes on between the US and China.
I think the French think of themselves as a Pacific power. They're because of their history, because of their holdings in the Pacific Islands, and they want to be more involved. They want to be a leading voice of Europe. They want to try to represent Europe in the Indo-Pacific and show that Europe has a role to play. The challenge, of course, is that the UK is also very engaged in a very different way in the Indo-Pacific. But ultimately, as you all know, the question is, what happens beyond the rhetoric? What is France actually bringing to the table? He talked a lot about coalitions and a new alliance, but it was very vague in terms of the specifics, right? What are the issues? What are the countries? How are they going to engage? And I think that's where the devil meets the details, especially in Southeast Asia, and especially in Singapore, where the rhetoric can be nice and it's good to have those statements, but very soon after the meeting, after the conference, you say, okay, what specifically are we going to do to move forward?
Just one follow-up on that. He was quite specific on China, urging China to stop, with North Korea, stop sending forces to help Russia's war in Ukraine if it wanted to avoid NATO expanding its role in Asia. Will China heed Macron's advice? Will it make any difference?
I think it's important for Beijing to see that its actions have costs, and that what it is doing to help Russia, what it's doing in Ukraine, what it's doing to support North Korea is not going to be contained to the Indo-Pacific, that China has a lot of interests in Europe, it has a lot of ambitions to be a global power, and that its actions in Ukraine are going to have consequences. And I think that's a very important message to send. And it's not just Macron's been sending that sort of message, but the fact that he said it here and said it in such a direct and pointed way, I think is something they can't ignore.
We're in conversation with a Denmark partner at the Asia Group, a long history working in U.S. government, most recently as senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, former Secretary of Defense, between 2022 and 2024. That brings us to the current Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who has just finished his remarks in the past 30 minutes or 40 minutes or so. Some of the things he was talking about, China's behavior toward its neighbors. The world is an urgent wake-up call, says Hegseth. He says the U.S. is watching China's destabilizing actions very closely. No, they won't put up with any attempt to change the South China Sea, et cetera, et cetera. Some kind of meat and potatoes discussions. He mentions Taiwan, of course, and all these others. I know you haven't listened super closely to the entire speech, but what you've heard so far from Hegseth when you were listening to it a short time ago, anything strike you or anything out of the ordinary for a U.S. Secretary of Defense? Sure.
So I think it's important to note that there's a lot of consistency in his messaging about the United States maintaining a robust role in the region, about the importance of our alliances and partnerships. I think it was a more pointed version of this speech, of those points. But certainly I think there's more continuity than sometimes we might expect coming from the Trump administration. But the three things I think are most significant coming here. One is calling on our allies and partners to do more in the region. He talked about getting GDP, getting defense spending to about 5% of GDP. Which, as you know from many countries in the Indo-Pacific, would mean more than doubling their defense budgets.
Which is the same message they've had in Europe as well against the NATO allies, right?
And
exactly.
Just to jump in, literally 5 minutes ago, ST filed a story, the Straits Times published a story that says the US expects Asian countries to increase their defense spending to match the levels that Washington expects of European allies, since they bear the brunt of the threat of China and North Korea in their backyards, according to Pete Hegseth.
Right.
So this has just been filed on the Straits Times,
Right.
just to your
and this
point.
has been a consistent message that Asia is facing a challenge from China, and that they need to put more in to defend themselves, that they can't just count on the United States to spend the resources to defend them from China, that Asian allies and partners need to do more to defend themselves. That's been very consistent in the Indo-Pacific, and it's the same message they've been sending to Europe. The second piece I mentioned is in stark contrast to what Macron was saying about the Indo-Pacific doesn't need to choose, that there's this other way. Hegseth was being very clear, choose the United States. And he cast it in the way of, we're working with you, we're defending your interests, we're defending your sovereignty. But he's very making it clear there's a competition, and it's in the best interests of these Indo-Pacific countries to side with the United States.
This is really tough. I hear what you're saying, but in an era where USAID is gone, where Voice of America is gone, where China is now already starting to fill the void with its soft power assets, and places like Singapore that toe a very, very delicate line and have for 60 years between the U.S. and China relations. This isn't easy for countries here that are depending actually a lot on China for a lot of different reasons.
Absolutely. It's a difficult message to hear. It's also difficult considering the tariffs that the Trump administration put in, the very difficult trade negotiations that are happening with these countries. And Hegseth seems to be arguing that those discussions on trade need to be separated or thought of as different than questions of defense and national security. The other piece that I thought was very interesting, just being in Singapore, was in his speech, Secretary of Defense Hegseth started to identify some parallels that he saw between President Trump and Lee Kuan Yew, which I thought was interesting.
Can't wait to see what social media has to say about that.
Well, I think he talked about how Lee Kuan Yew saw the importance of sovereignty and commerce as key drivers of a national identity. But what he didn't talk about was Lee Kuan Yew's emphasis on international law, international norms, and a lot of other
and free
pieces,
trade. Hello,
free trade, that which I'd say is part of international laws and norms that the Trump administration has been opposed to. So it was an interesting contrast that I thought I would be curious how friends in Singapore reacted to.
Nice try, but maybe.
Yeah, I mean, one built a country third world to first world in a single generation. The other one built some golf courses. So you can see the similarities there. But coming back to Glenn's point about not having to choose. Pete Hegseth met with Lawrence Wong the day before on the sidelines. Hegseth affirmed his support for the Singapore Armed Forces training in the US, as you would expect. And Prime Minister Wong emphasized Singapore's long-standing support for the US's regional presence, as you would expect. But you're not going to get someone like PM Wong, or anybody else for that matter, to pick a side, which is what you're alluding to. Right. Would that be fair?
I think that's fair. And those of us who watch the Indo-Pacific know that, right? We understand how this is happening. We understand the delicate balance that countries across the Indo-Pacific need to strike, and how they're trying to navigate these issues. That's why these sorts of engagements are so important, because it's important to hear from our friends in the Indo-Pacific, from across ASEAN, about how they're seeing the competition between China and the United States and how they're trying to navigate this. So that's why I'm very interested in what the Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim is going to be saying as chair of ASEAN, having just hosted the ASEAN summit. His voice, I think, is especially consequential to see how they react to the message from Macron, from Hegseth, and the others that have been speaking, to see how ASEAN is, how the ASEAN states see themselves as navigating these very complicated dynamics.
Yeah, we're talking with Abe Denmark, a partner at the Asia Group. Abe, is the message more important than the messenger? You look at Hegseth and there's been a lot of baggage around him from the earliest days of his being voted formally for the Secretary of Defense and his past let's just say some of his past issues, versus somebody like Lloyd Austin, decorated war, a decorated general, and things like. Are they taking maybe some of the things that Hegseth is saying at a different level of importance than they might with somebody that has more credibility as a military person? Or is it just got to be the message, and who you got in front of you now is what you get?
Well, I've
sorry, I didn't phrase that
it's fine.
very elegantly, but
I've worked for several secretaries of defense and for both major American political parties, and each secretary of defense is different. The message is important if it's seen as credibly representing the views of the administration, because ultimately the decisions that folks are concerned about are coming from the president, right? So is the Secretary of Defense credibly representing the views of the president? And I think that Secretary Hegseth did a good job of representing the president's views, of explaining their approach to the Indo-Pacific, and so that gives him a lot of credibility. The difference, though, is the personalities, I think, come out more in the private meetings. When you're in a small, more quiet room and you're engaging on a human level, one-to-one, and that's where I think the experiences, the stature, and just the personalities play a more significant role.
Lots of comments coming in, Abe, since you've joined our show. So if you do want to post any questions, WhatsApp 88550893. Ian asks, would France potentially join the five-power defence agreement, which, of course, is currently between Australia, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore and the UK? Would France potentially join that agreement? That's putting you on the spot, isn't it?
That is putting me on the spot. As an American, I have very little say in any of this, right?
Yeah.
Very little? You mean none?
None. Well,
assuming that none of us do.
So, as you know, as Americans, we think that we have a voice on everything, right? Even if we do or not.
Fair enough.
I think it'd be very unlikely to answer Ian's question for France to join this, because they do see themselves as having a very unique role. There's also a lot of historical baggage of France's role in CETO and those sorts of things. So I think it would be unlikely, but I do think France is trying to figure out what role do they have in the Indo-Pacific and how can they credibly play a role, especially considering they're also dealing with an ongoing war in Ukraine.
All right, let's bring it back to China. So China has not sent their defense minister, Dong Jun, to the Shangri-La Dialogues. This is the first time since 2019 that China has not been represented by its defense minister. What do you make of that?
So it's interesting. There's a lot of senior Chinese leaders from the PLA that are under house arrest or otherwise unavailable because of the ongoing purges happening in China. I don't know if that's true for the defense minister, but the fact that they didn't send a defense minister, I think, shows that they have a lot of concerns about their role at Shangri-La. Shangri-La is an uncontrolled environment for them, where they get asked questions that they don't know ahead of time. They're not able to pre-coordinate the answers, so it's a high-risk environment for Chinese leaders. Whereas their own fora, like the Boao Forum, they're able to tightly control all the messaging, tightly control the questions, and so that's a much safer environment. So my read on that is they're just very anxious about how their messaging would be received there. So they sent a senior academic from one of the PLA military academies who doesn't have nearly the credibility. But the key piece here, and this is why I'm not putting too much weight on it, is that in the Chinese system, the defense minister is also not a terribly powerful person. It's not like a normal minister of defense or secretary of defense where they're making key decisions. In the Chinese system, the defense minister is more of a figurehead, more of a person whose job it is to talk to foreign counterparts. So it's not a huge downgrade, but it is, I think, an important signal coming from Beijing that they're not too excited about an uncontrolled environment, and they're just sort of letting this play out, and they'll have their say later on in their own forums.
You've done a lot of work looking at issues around the region, not just defense issues. So I can just pivot for a moment to some of the other things happening this year. 75 nations that were beneficiaries of loans from China and the Belt and Road Initiative are on the hook to pay back $22 billion in payments to repay some of those loans. This is going to be a very pivotal moment for a lot of countries around this region who, frankly, the economies are not doing well and may be in trouble paying back some of those loans. When you look broadly at the region and the dynamics of the trade situation, the trade wars and tariffs and these loans coming due and shifting alliances. How do you make sense at the Asia group? How do you consult people as to how to plan for the future? We are truly in the VUCA world that none of us had really expected we would be in.
Yeah, we're at a critical juncture right now, in that several of the Asian economies, their economies are probably going to underperform than compared to previous expectations. And the United States is changing its approach pretty dramatically. The tariffs and the trade negotiations are striking at some of the hearts of a lot of these export-oriented economies. And China is going to try to make the best of it, trying to use this moment to try to advance their own interests. But I think the key here is that the United States has played a critical role in the region for decades. And that critical role does not change depending on who's occupying the White House. So from the perspective of the Asia Group, we work closely with companies that are navigating these waters and helping them identify where their best places are to operate. How do they inject themselves into a lot of these opportunities? How do they engage with Asian governments? How do they best engage with American counterparts? And there's always this sort of trite statement that in chaos, in uncertainty, there's also opportunity.
Right.
So we're working with a lot of these companies to identify what are these opportunities, how do they become a part of these trade negotiations, how do they contribute to American interests, how do they contribute to the interests of the countries they're coming from.
That's really complex.
How do they navigate these complexities?
That is really complex.
Yeah.
Very
Speaking
complex.
of interest, business, safety and security, we haven't got much time, but I do want to bring up the fact that Gaza has already featured prominently in the dialogues. Prime Minister Lawrence Wong and Macron essentially said the same thing, which is Israel may be in breach of international law by restricting the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. I'm not asking you to comment on that specifically, but more broadly, will the Gaza conflict feature in the Shangri-La dialogues and moving forward with business?
I think the shadow of what's happening in Gaza is already having an impact on how many countries in Southeast Asia, especially Muslim-majority countries, see the United States, how they view international politics. So that's one of the reasons I mentioned Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, to see if Gaza will come up in his remarks. So it's something we're watching closely, and I think it does impact how a lot of these countries view the United States and our role in the world.
Fantastic.
We are going to leave it there.
But before you do,
yes.
I just want to say this.
Got it.
Lynn says, congratulations on your coverage on the 2025 Shangri-La Dialogues. Abraham's commentary and your questions to him provide a greater understanding of these important issues. She is listening down in Australia, where they're getting some coverage, but not enough, and our segment has been invaluable.
There you go, Lynn. That's why you're one of our favorite listeners.
Thanks, Lynn.
And thanks to you, Abe Denmark, partner at the Asia Group. Really appreciate you coming in today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.